This is Dan Owen, and this is another edition of Passage Attack. Today we're going to put a larger passage of Scripture together. Last week we were talking about a couple of parables at the end of Matthew 24 and the beginning of Matthew 25. But today I'd like to show you how the larger passage comes together. One of the most difficult passages for scholars and students to understand is Matthew 24. Where it's hard to figure out what Jesus is talking about and what he's really referring to in some of this passage. But it helps to know that the three parables at the end of Matthew 24 are really the explanation of Jesus' main point. Let's begin today by looking at the first part of Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. He has just left the temple buildings, and he has told his disciples in the first couple of verses that there's not going to be one stone left upon another. All of these things are going to be thrown down. We're going to begin in our study today with the third verse of Matthew 24. So let's look. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, notice their question, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The disciples seemed to think that those things were all going to happen together. They could not conceive of Jerusalem being destroyed without the coming of the Son of Man into his kingdom and the end of the age. But Jesus responds, trying to correct that notion. He says, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Verse 6, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. Notice here, but the end is not yet. You see, Jesus is trying to tell them that yes, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. Yes, their temple is going to be destroyed, but that does not equate to the end of the age. He says they've got things to do, and they've got experiences to go through, and they're not done yet. Look down at verse 9. He's talking to his apostles. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, notice the idea of enduring to the end here in verse 13, will be saved. Verse 14 is key, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Notice in the question back up in verse 3, they wanted all these things in their minds to happen at the same time. But in verse 3 and in verse 6 and in verse 14, the end is mentioned. And in verse 6 and 14, the end is not yet, but the end only happens after the preaching of the gospel is done to the whole world. Now, let's go to the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, and after that we'll wrap all of this together into a package. Last week we spoke about the two parables, one at the end of Matthew 24, the other at the beginning of Matthew 25, that are about the coming of the Son of Man, the delay in his coming, and the necessity for people to be ready for his coming. This passage continues those themes. As in the last passage attack, we talked about the coming of the Son of Man and the delay of that coming and the weeping and gnashing of teeth that would be there for those that weren't ready for his coming. Let's look at our passage today and search for those very same elements. First of all, let's look for the elements concerning the coming of the Son of Man. As in the other stories, somebody's gone. Somebody's out of the picture. And you'll notice here at the beginning of this parable, this is like a man that was going on a journey. Just as Jesus went away, he went on a journey. And then if you'll look at verse 15, after he gives the talents to the various servants, it says there that he went away. And if you'll go down to verse 19, it says at the end that the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. This is very much like what happened in the parable at the end of Matthew 24, where the master of those servants came. And then you have this reckoning that shows up after he comes. Now, the second element in this passage is, as in the others, the element of delay. And you'll notice that just as it was in the other two, here in verse 19, it says, after a long time, the master of those servants came. See, this wasn't a quick coming. This wasn't an immediate coming. This was after a long time. And then finally, you'll notice that at the end of this, when the master makes a reckoning with the servants, and especially a reckoning with the wicked servant, he says in verse 30, cast that wicked, worthless servant into the outer darkness. And then he says, in that place there will be weeping and the gnashing of teeth. Notice that that's the identical phrase that you have at the end of Matthew chapter 24. Remember that Jesus is trying to show that his coming is not going to happen when Jerusalem falls and all those other things happen. Matthew 24:6, the end is not yet. Matthew 24:14, the gospel has to be preached to the whole world and then the end will come. Now let's go back and see how that ties in to the end of Matthew 24. Let's look at verse 42 again. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch. Look at verse 44. So you must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Well, this is precisely the point of the first part of Matthew 24. The end is not yet. There's work to be done, and then the end will come. So he's going to come when you don't expect him. Look at verse 45 of Matthew 24. This is the first parable we dealt with. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household, and will give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. See, Jesus is coming, the coming of the Son of Man. But remember, that wicked servant in verse 48 says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. See, they thought he was coming right back and that the end was right now, but he's staying away a long time. Look at verse 50, Matthew 24:50. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect, and on an hour when he is not aware. See? And he's the one that's going to be thrown out into that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So just as Jesus said in the introduction of Matthew 24 that the end is not yet and other things have to happen before the end comes, so in the first story, the master stays away for a long time, and the servant doesn't think the master's coming back, and the master comes when he doesn't expect. Now, the same exact story is told in the parable of the wise and foolish virgins in Matthew chapter 25. There you have some of the virgins bringing just enough oil to fill their lamps because they think it's just going to be a short time. The rest of the virgins bring extra oil. Why? Because they're prepared for the long haul. They're prepared for a longer wait. And they fall asleep. You know the story. So when the bridegroom is announced as coming, they're not ready. They don't have enough oil. And so it says in Matthew 25, verse 10, but while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom came. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. And then if you drop down to verse 13, it says, therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Again, the point is, the end is not yet. You're going to have to be prepared for a longer time. There's going to be a delay, and there's things to do, so you got to be ready. The parable of the talents is the same way. The master goes away on a journey. See, Jesus has gone back to heaven. Matthew 25:19 again. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. See, he came at a different time than they expected. And of course then the emphasis of this is that, were you busy doing what I told you to do while I was away? Were you investing my money, etc.? And the one who did not bother to do that, well, of course, he's cast outside where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So when we put this passage together, if you'll read Matthew 24:6, all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. And Matthew 24:14, the gospel of the kingdom must be preached in the whole world for a testimony unto all the nations, and then the end will come. That's really the meat of the entire couple of chapters. The three parables at the end, the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant, the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, the parable of the talents. All three of those parables are just illustrating the idea that Jesus is going to be away for a long time. You don't know when he's coming back, and you need to be ready. I hope this helps you put those three passages together and see that the three parables at the end are the key to understanding the main message of this difficult chapter. That's Passage Attack. I hope you have a great day.